All righty. Well, we're going to start this program. So this particular program, I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. So we are the chapter coordinators, and I'm on the left there, and there's Carrie on the right, just to give you guys a visual. We both work together at the St. Louis Zoo, and we are both chapter coordinators. So if you have programs during this program or after, feel free to reach out. Their email addresses are on the screen there. And this is a larger collaboration. If you can see all the different partners we've had over the years and currently. With COVID, it's changed a little bit. Usually we do these trainings in person at different facilities, but this year with the COVID pandemic, we are doing this virtual. Does not stop anybody though from going out and collecting data. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Just to give you a little more information about our chapter here. We do have other partners, especially at Shaw Nature Preserve. So a shout out to Rachel Wellner. So if you happen to be out there, she's one of our other people who work with us and also offers trainings and things like that. So keep an eye out. If we happen to offer a frog walk or something at a Shaw Nature Preserve, that would be the person that would be training it. Give me 1 second. My cat just jumped on my screen and hit my keyboard. Hold on 1 second. There we go. So today's topics, we're going to cover the background and general information, and that'll be the first information. It shouldn't take too long, but I wanted to give everybody a general overview of what's going on with frogs and toads and about this particular program. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on FrogWatch protocols. And if anybody out there has participated in the past, the protocols typically have not changed, but we're going to cover some information about the platform that has updated and changed a little bit and actually has made it a lot easier to collect data in the field. My wife and I have actually been collecting data. We've moved recently out to Fenton area. So we've been using the new platform, and it is doable on a telephone, which is really neat. And we'll get to that in a little bit. We are also going to finish up, which is for me, the most exciting part, which is the auditory training. So we're going to be learning some of our frog calls. Some people, this may be an introduction and you're not expected to know every single frog call. And we're going to relieve you with places you could go for great resources in the future to listen, to practice your calls, and anything else that you would need to participate. So give you guys some background and general information. I'm going to start simple, and then that will get more in depth. And as we get to the end of this section, if you have some follow-up questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or we can open it up and you guys are welcome to ask questions live. So real quick, amphibians, they are vertebrates, which means they do have a backbone in their body. And yes, there are many of them that I have seen that don't quite look like they have bones. They can squish down pretty flat, but they do break into 3 major categories. Obviously, we're going to be focused on the frogs and toads, but there's the salamanders and then there's caecilians. And if you've never heard of the 3rd category, which is okay, we don't have any here in North America. As you head down towards Mexico and Central America, you will pick up caecilians. They're particularly fossorial, which means they live under the ground, under the leaf litter. So you don't see them very often, and you don't actually see them very often in zoos or any other in captivity. They're very hard to breed. We don't know a lot about the particular species. They find more about them as they accidentally come across them when they're doing excavation in other places in Central and South America and in Asia. There's also a few species in there. They're really unique if you imagine something the size of a small snake with a skeleton but has the skin of an amphibian. Pretty unique animals. So when you talk about frogs and toads, it's important to remember some of the basic characteristics. They typically have that smooth, moist, or bumpy skin. And why it's important is they do respirate a lot through the skin, and the skin's used for all kinds of things. They do communicate, and sometimes it's communication with color. So it might be letting people know that they are toxic. And it also has a huge protection. It keeps these guys from the water from escaping their body, which is why a lot of times the next major characteristic, they secrete mucus, and that protects them from predators attacking them. A lot of the mucus has chemicals in it that doesn't taste very good and also prevents desiccation. And then the other major characteristic that separates them out from a lot of other species, when you look really close, there's not a lot of keratin on their toes, and which means there's no nails, like nail beds or anything like that. They do have sometimes protrusions at the end, but they do have a lot of unique adaptations around their toes, whether webbed or not. Gives you an idea of where they particularly live. They do, at least in our country, have external fertilization. So in North American frogs, they're going to lay their eggs and fertilize them outside of the body. They're going to lay their eggs in our area in water. There are species in the world that lay their eggs in wet, moist areas. In our area, they're going to be finding a pool of water. And it could be an ephemeral pool, so something where the rain sits for a month and dries out, but it's going to be typically in a body of water. And the young are going to develop through metamorphosis. And so we probably are all familiar with the term tadpole or something like that, or the larval stage. All of our frogs and toads we're talking about are going to go through that. And with that being said, it's not all equal in the fact how fast it is. Some of the species we'll talk about may take up to a year to 2 years. Some may metamorphosize, from the egg all the way to the froglet coming out or toadlet within a very short time, maybe a month. So some of these guys can metamorphosize very fast. They've adapted for some different types of habitats. I mentioned earlier they have the skeleton, but if you take a look in here, they do have the large orbital eye areas, which is really unique. What makes them a little bit different than other species, and you look down the picture below it, the little eyeball picture. What's kind of unique in that one is they can move that eye. And so they have the ability with muscles to pull the eye actually down into the skull and the cavity in the skull to protect their eyes. And so when they're underwater, they're burying the ground. They do have an eyelid that covers and it protects it because their eyesight is fantastic. If you're going to try to catch a frog or a toad during the day is the worst time to do it because their eyesight is wonderful. And so at nighttime, it's a little easier with light shining on them, just like deers in the headlight, they'll stay still for a little bit and you get a little closer. But what the eyes also help is with it, believe it or not, swallowing their food. When the eye goes down in that orbit, they are able to actually pull it down so fast that the roof of their mouth bends down. So if you're food in their mouth, they can actually take their eyes and hit the food underneath and push the food down their throat, which is an amazing way to swallow your food. You see it more often, I've seen in toads. So the difference, I'm always asked, what is the difference between a frog and a toad? They are taxonomically usually put in different categories because they're not 100% related. They're in the same larger group, but there are some things to look out for that makes them a little bit different. So real quick, and this one I got in the wrong place, but implexus is one of the other major differences between you see in frogs and toads. And so this is where, and the guy on the top is the male and this is the female. But this is their mating style. So the male will on top release sperm on top of the eggs coming out and fertilize them. So when you look at frogs and toads, you can take a look at that skin. And on the right is the toad. On the left is the frog skin. And you can see one seems shinier, wetter, has more mucus on it and is thinner. The one on the right is thicker. And so you see bumps. And many people will ask, are they warts? The answer is no. They are skin bumps. Sometimes people refer to them as warts, but it's thickened skin or keratinized skin. But it is very glandular on both of these guys. And what that means is slime can come out through lots of little holes. On toads, sometimes a lot of the toxins are going to be grouped, and you can kind of see it up here in the very top of this picture, on parotid glands. And those are where most of the toxins will be secreted, whereas you might be a different kind of frog where some of the toxins are oozed out all over the body. And the toxins come in a variety. Some are very nasty, burn your lips, make you sick, and some just don't taste good. So there's a variety of it as far as toxicity goes. One of the other big differences between frogs and toads a little bit is the style of eggs, and it's just the way they've adapted. And so if you take a look on the left, this is traditionally what you would think of as a frog egg. And they can be a little bit different, but typically they're grouped together like a mass of little circles, and you can see the little embryo inside there. On the right, toads typically lay eggs on strings. And so you almost look like a clear coating and with the little embryos inside there. But that's one of the differences when you see, looks like a little pile of strings or a necklace on the water, that's going to be a toad. If it's big masses like this, it's going to be typically a frog. Now, if it was really jelly-like with dots inside, it might be a salamander. They look a little bit different. And then another major difference is we don't always think about it because you don't get to see the inside. But one of the jobs at the zoo I have is I do clean skulls and stuff. We preserve stuff for educational purposes. And it is really neat when you get a chance to look, and you kind of see it on the picture on the left, but frogs actually have upper teeth. And so if you were to look right up here, you can actually see those ridges of teeth. If you go to the one on the right, which is a toad, you're going to see just straight bone. Toads typically don't have any teeth in their mouth. And so it makes a little bit different, which is why we've always think of sometimes toads using that tongue, and they do use a little more sometimes than other species. So we're talking about frogs and toads. What is going on and why do we have programs like this? Well, if you're not familiar with what's going on, this is a little bit older slide, but it gives you an idea, which is number one, these are an approximation of how groups are doing. And you can see the downward trend of amphibians as far as populations go over time. Obviously, corals on the top, we're not doing a program about corals, are not doing very well at all. But frogs and toads definitely are declining worldwide. If you were to look at all over the world, you can see in this map, these are the hot spots. So this is where most diversity of the world is, which is in the tropical regions. And there's a huge decline in these major areas. And there's a lot of reasons why, and we're going to get to why they are being affected. Well, number one, it's important to remember because of their skin and it's thin and they can respirate, which means air can pass in and out, so can water. Many different things can go through those skins. So chemicals, for example, we have the luxury of putting hand sanitizer on our hands. If you were to do that on a frog or a toad, it doesn't take long for a lot of that stuff, if it's wet, to actually go through that skin and mix inside the body. And so anything that gets into the waterways has a quicker chance of affecting frogs and toads, and their life cycle, all of it is in water. If you lay your eggs in water, your tadpole stage is in water, and you go in and out for breeding purposes, or you happen to be a type of frog that is adapted for living most of your life in the water, you're going to come in contact with a lot more chemicals. And so some frog species may be more affected than others by pollution, but they all, unfortunately, can be quite affected faster than other animals. There's some other major causes I was going to put out here. And number one, these are actually listed in somewhat order of how they're being affected, but habitat loss is still number one across the world. And it's just the habitat is being destroyed. Even in our area, I think it's close to 75 to 80% of the wetlands of the Midwestern United States have been drained and disappeared. I grew up in Orlando, Florida. Obviously grew up as a child going to Disneyland. That used to be a wetland at one point. And so over time, through urbanization, we've changed the landscape, and a lot of the frogs and toad habitats have disappeared. Pollution, of course, is a big deal, as well as environmental changes, increasing different predators, exotic and invasive species in some different areas of the United States. Global climate change is creeping up there is a big effect, especially for species that might be mountain species. And you can't, as the temperature rises, you can't go any higher in a mountain area. And there's many other reasons why global climate change can easily affect some of even the frogs in our area because of the changing weather pattern. It changes the timing when they come out and their food when it comes out. In some places, the pet trade or the food trade can have an effect. The biggest one that a lot of people may not be aware of, there's a disease that is spreading. There's always different diseases, but one of them that is right now a major problem is chytromyiasis, which is sometimes referred to as amphibian chytrid, or BD. It stands for the Bacteriochytrium dendrobatus, which nobody wants to say, which is the scientific name of the particular fungus that is affecting these guys, and here's what it kind of looks like. So if you were to zoom in, it looks weird, like a weird creature, but it is a fungus that can grow on skin of an amphibian, and what it does is breaks down the keratin in their skin. Unfortunately, if you break down enough keratin, you can get microscopic holes in your skin. It's like having a fungal infection, like kind of like athlete's foot, but worse. And they can obviously eventually then die of other diseases, but it affects their immune system. And so when they get coated with this, it does become a big deal. And some species automatically have antifungal properties in their slime, and so they can fight it off. Some species have never been introduced to this particular chytrid fungus that's spread around the world, and so they have a harder time. Some of them die right off. They just have no immunity to it. So right now, for what we can tell by testing water, and different studies have been done in the Midwest, it's probably almost everywhere. So a lot of our frog species have had it, have adapted. Doesn't mean they're not being affected by it, but we don't have massive die-offs from chytrid fungus that we're aware of. I'm sure it has an effect. But there are still a few places in the United States, typically out west, there's a few species that are more affected. There's places they've never had introduced. And so when it gets there, it has a bigger effect. But it is in play here. And so it's something that a lot of people are still looking at, but it is, from what I can tell, everywhere. Even talking to some of the people at our herpetarium, we've even tested our fountains, and it's there. It's in all over the place. But why should we care? So if amphibian populations are decreasing, is there a reason why we should worry about it? Well, it's an old phrase. It's not my favorite one, canary in the coal mine, but it does bring up the fact that it does sometimes can sound an alarm when some of our frog and toad species are disappearing. it is a good indication of our waterways. And if you look at St. Louis and the history of it, a lot of our waterways, even in like the core of our city, has been altered, some for flood control and many other reasons. A lot of our streams, right, at least the downtown area, used to be used as sewers. And they've been channelized, they've been changed. We've added fish to a lot of our areas, and some frogs and toads have evolved to live in areas where there weren't any fish. And so it's harder and harder for them to find the appropriate habitat that exists anymore. And so sometimes they get pushed farther and farther out away from the urbanization. They are also important. Number one, they're great pest control. If you think of how much food, as far as insects they eat, is a lot. It's not as large as bats, but they do eat a large amount, and they come in all different sizes. So if you think of something like this picture is a green frog eating some middle-sized cricket or something like that. But they range in size from the end of your finger to something pretty large, and so they eat a huge variety of insects and everything from mosquito larvae all the way up to sometimes small birds. And so they're wonderful to have out in the environment for food control, but also they're food for many other species. So when you start to lose a lot of the diversity, unfortunately, it starts to unbalance some of our food chain. And sometimes we get spikes in mosquitoes and we have to spray. So there's a lot of different consequences for losing some of our diversity. They're also really important for medicine. There's a lot of research going on studying some of the chemicals in their skin that they secrete, usually for their protection, but they've been able to use it in a lot of different medicines. So it is important that we try to conserve and save a lot of our frog and toad species. So what is FrogWatch? This training is about FrogWatch. So I'm going to get into what it is. So FrogWatch is a long-term frog and toad citizen science monitoring program, which as a sentence is kind of boring. So to give a little different view of it, it is a daily monitoring service. So it was created to look at frogs and toads during their breeding season because they're loud and noisy. And it's an easier way to get an idea of how our frogs and toads are doing across the United States. It is a long-term study that's been going on since I think 1998 officially. So it has a large data set. And it's also looking at the phenology, which is the timing when frogs and toads come out, if they shift, and the presence and absence of different species. So today, chapters, there's around, I think it's actually bigger than this now, but about 158 chapters. It ranges at least across 30 states, and they keep adding more chapters every year. We usually, each chapter tries to offer some kind of regional training. We're trying to expand out and get more data sets, but it's pretty large. Right now, I think this, I need to update the slide, but since 2019, there was 3,000 registered sites with observations, which collectively collected 10,000 plus registered volunteers across the United States collecting observations. And so it's a massive amount of data sets, and you'll have access, everybody does, to go look at how much data is collected and where that data is, what we're finding. Our site, as of last year, with COVID going on and other things, we had 8 active sites, but we still had 187 observations at those sites. And so it still helps us collect data in our area. I am, of course, trying to get more sites registered so we can continually monitor how our frogs and toads are doing across the St. Louis area. And then includes outside of 270, includes out in the Franklin County and surrounding counties. And on the Illinois side, we want to know what's going on around our city area. Just kind of give you an idea, our observations go up and down, but we've been pretty good above, usually close to 200 in most years. Some of the amount of sites we have monitored every year goes up and down, but we do collect quite a lot of data for our area. And what we've learned so far in our area, right now, oh, I didn't fix this slide. Sorry, you can't read everything, but there's about 10 different species observed in our area. And these are just pictures of some of the different species. Now there's more than that around here, but these are the most common ones that we have observed. The ones that we get most records on, and is probably because of timing, the gray tree frog is probably one of the loudest ones, comes out when a lot of people start observing. Spring peeper is also another one that we're going to talk about today. But these are the ones that we get most observations about. Now, what we have learned, though, by looking at where the observations are, and this is a map of, you look on the left, all these little dots, these are all the collection of frog and toad observations. And this includes other platforms, so citizen science platforms. And this includes FrogWatch. It also includes iNaturalist observations. You can see there's a lot of great observations. People are collecting a lot of data. But when you start looking species by species, we did find a trend. And one of the things we found, if you just were to look at these 3 species, we found that most of them are found on the outside of Interstate 270. You can obviously, if you go back, you can see there's a lot of other frog observations, but they are not these particular species. All 3 of these species that we will be talking about today as part of the training, and many more, they're all related to tree frogs. And so this is the tree frog family. These guys are a little more specialized. They don't go up and down trees typically. But for some reason, these are more affected than others by whatever's happening, the urbanization inside that 270. And in some pockets right outside 270, they're starting to disappear. Carrie had mentioned the chorus frog and Creve Core area. And so there are observations there. And I have a new project that I'm working on called the Spring Peeper Project. We were monitoring these particular species. This year, we're using data that FrogWatch volunteers are collecting, as well as we're putting out monitoring devices. And so we're trying to really find out what's going on with these particular species inside this area. But we still want to know about every species in our area. And how's the data being used? I just mentioned my project, but for the bigger picture, the national picture, it helps describe local diversity as well as detect rare and invasive species. Sometimes the shift, we might see ranges change a little bit on the edges. And it also gives us an idea of wetland health. As more and more of these species disappear, obviously, then the sites aren't registered. So it gives us an idea where some of the good wetlands still might exist. And then I had mentioned my particular program is supporting some of the objectives of trying to find out what's going on with these particular species and if there's still suitable habitat within the St. Louis metro area. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there before we get into protocols. Does anybody have any questions about what FrogWatch is in general, and anything about the basics of frogs and toads? And I'll give you
Mike,
Yep, go ahead.
really quick, in the chat, we had a question that I am not able to answer, but it is a good one as far as amphibian conservation. When we were talking about chemicals leaching into amphibian skin, and you were talking about like mosquito control, Rachel had a question if the county and their weekly spraying in the summer could affect populations, and then asked, is there any existing petition or movement to try to get the county to move towards IPM?
So from what I know, there can be an effect on some species. It depends on what they're using. There is no petition that I am aware of. I'm interested in getting involved in those conversations. I am not part of any of those conversations as of right now. But that's something I would be interested in the future to talk to anybody that has an interest. So in short, yes, it can have an effect. And there's research on certain chemicals out there. There's all alternatives. I don't know enough to say anything beyond that, but that's a wonderful question, something we can definitely explore at other meetings or other times. Good question. Are there any additional questions?
We just had another one from Brooke, and she asked if you have any Illinois data.
We do. I'm sorry I did not show up there. On the other side of the river, yes, we do have some Illinois data. I don't have that many sites registered, unfortunately, in the Illinois side. I would love to get more on that side, but we have had over the years, I think a handful, maybe 5 sites. So my data, unfortunately, on that particular side of the river is not very in depth, but we do have some.
Thank you. That was all for the questions in the chat, although we did have a question very early on in the presentation from Al about getting copies of the slides. And in the chat, I had posted that we will share out a Google site that everybody will be able to visit. It does have all of the slides from the various presentations that Mike will go through. And it also has some really great calls for our common frogs for you to practice.
Correct. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, at the very end, we'll go over some resources that you'll have access to, as well as when this is recorded, we will be putting this up, and I'll also probably send a link out. We'll mention at the end, but we have our own Facebook page here, so we'll post a link to this presentation here for those if you want to share it with other people. So great question. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to keep on going, and we'll take a little official break after the next section. 1 second here. Here we go. Okay, we are going to move on to Okay. Okay. So hopefully we can see the new slides. Carrie, do you see a new section?
Yes, we
Okay.
see.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're going to start talking about protocols. I wanted to talk about this, and if you happen to see it when you registered, there was something called FrogWatch Lite. And what we are doing today is I consider the traditional FrogWatch, I'm misspelling, volunteer session here. And the difference is, I just wanted to go over the quick differences. FrogWatch Lite was made to be more of an introduction to get people interested if they didn't have any knowledge of frogs and toads, didn't have the commitment time. It uses a different platform. It still helps collect data. But the biggest difference is you can do it anytime. If you happen to be at a park, you saw a frog or a toad, and you could do both of these, but if you see a picture, what we're asking people is to collect recordings, like audio recordings and pictures using iNaturalist. If you're not familiar with that, we will have a link to that, and it explains how to use that program. It's just another way, a quick way to collect data. It does not follow the FrogWatch protocols, and it doesn't register to a site. It just helps collect other data, presence and absence for the most part. So if it's something anybody's interested in, let us know. We will have links to that. Today, when we talk about FrogWatch, what the difference is we're going to go through all the protocols in a minute of how you to collect the data, how to submit the data. And the other difference within as a volunteer is you would have the opportunity to either one, create your own site, which takes a little more time, and monitor your own site and collect data for your site, or you could help collect data occasionally if you had time for one of the chapter sites. And so we will have a registered site that we're asking people right now. It's in Forest Park. And we're going to try to have more in the future. But those are some options that if you did not want to register a site, the reason why it takes a little less time to use one of our sites is because we'll have multiple people going there. You wouldn't have to monitor it every, twice a week, because we may have somebody going there occasionally. And so those are some of the different options, and it's based on commitment and amount of time you may have. So we're going to go through now the full FrogWatch volunteer participation training of what you would need to do. So first of all, it's important to know that the data you're collecting is going to be input into a program called FieldScope. And I'm going to spend a minute going into what FieldScope is. And so when you take a look at it, this is what the screenshot, and I have a few in here. It's an online database that allow you to log in, create an account, and it'll allow you to look at your data and input data as well as register a site. And you're welcome to at the end here if you want to explore it. It's open to the public. You can't add data unless you have an account. And so one of the first things you would do is to set up an account. You go online, you can type in FrogWatch FieldScope. It's pretty easy. Use an email address and you create a password and you create an account. And once you create an account, what you'll notice is up here in the left-hand corner, the same page opens up, but now you have the option to add data. And so they just redid this particular format. And so it's a little bit different if you happen to go over some of our past trainings. It's actually a little easier, I think, to put some of the data in. It's also friendly for smartphones, and I'll get to that in a minute. So you don't necessarily have to collect data in the field and go back home and go on a computer and like hand type your data in. You can actually do it in the field if you wanted to. But we're going to go over what you would need to collect and everything you would need to register a site and how to collect data. And if you explore the site, there's lots of other things you can do on the site. I'm not going to go through everything except for how to register a site today and how to add data. So once you log in, you're going to get a screen looks like this. You can, hit, I'm going to add data, and this page pops up. And so if you take a look, it says observations, and I circle down here how to add a station. So one of the first things you would want to do is either one, add a chapter station, or you would want to register your own. And so I'm going to walk through how to register your own station, and we're going to do a couple of these things live. So first thing we want to do though is if you wanted to choose your own site, there's a few things to know. And so one, you're going to need to pick a place that's convenient to access on a weekly basis. And it doesn't mean you have to go put observations every single week, but typically if you can go once to twice a week, it gives us a better breadth of what's going on your site. And one of the questions people ask is how long do you have to monitor a site? And it does depend. And once you register a site and you visit the site, you get a better idea. Because some places, for example, you may have spring breeders that come out early in the spring and nothing else. So by the time you get to May, it winds down and nothing else ever calls. And so your site, for the most part, may start from February and end in May. There may be sites where nothing calls until the end of May because it's a pond and it has bullfrogs and green frogs, and you don't hear any other spring breeders. And so it depends on what site you pick. You typically want a site that I would consider quiet and not necessarily near an interstate if possible. It makes it harder to hear the animals and identify them correctly. And the other biggest ones I had out here is you want it to be safe for data collection in the evening time. You need to go there, and we'll go over the protocols, typically a half an hour after sunset, and it needs to be legally accessible. And so that's why I put this private property, no trespassing. It is important that you pick a site that's, it's in the evening, it's legal to go. Some parks and places like that have curfews, and you need to observe those. Now, it doesn't mean you can't reach out and get permission to go to those places. Carrie and I, if you have a place you're interested in, are more than happy on your behalf to help you reach out to those places. And sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they'll say, we don't want you to be going there at, this particular time at night. It does depend. Some places you can find that it's just really easy. For example, in Forest Park, to pull up to the curb, roll your window down, listen, collect your observations, and drive on. It has a curfew, I think, up to 10 o'clock at night. So there are places that are just easy and it's safe to go to, but those are things to think about. We don't want anybody going places that are unsafe to go. We wanted to make sure that you're going places that are legally accessible. And if you have questions about that, you're having trouble locating a place, let us know. With that being said, there's a lot of different choices out there. Now, there is some information you would need to collect or at least figure out ahead of time before you go to register your site. I typically recommend going to the place definitely during the daytime to look around, see if you see a frog or a toad moving. That's definitely a good sign that you're going to be hearing something at some point in the season. Looking around, because in the daytime you can see things, and you're going to have to answer a few questions about it, and you do the best that you can, and we can help you answer some of those. But what kind of type of habitat do you think it is? When you go online, you're going to pull down menus. I'm going to walk through that in a second. But source of origin of water, you take your best guess by looking around the area. And you answer questions if you think it's permanent or not. And you can update things if you find things change after you register your site. Use of land within the area. Obviously you need the longitude and latitude, and you're going to register it through the online site. So one of the things I mentioned, the word wetland, it is important because they're going to ask you what kind of wetland you think it is. But typically FrogWatch USA considers that frogs and toads, they have to have water to breed. And so a wetland is defined by the presence of plants that are known to grow in saturated conditions and soils that lack oxygen and water that typically is near the surface during some part of the growing season. So this could include everything from an ephemeral pond, so a wet area that water sits for 2 months, and frogs and toads can breed in it. It is considered a usable wetland if they're breeding in it. It could be a ditch on the side of the road where you can pull up or nearby in a parking lot and listen. So there's a lot of choices when you're picking a spot. We are looking for places that frogs and toads are breeding. I found places that are near a gas station where you can actually listen from the gas station, because the area it floods and it sits there for 2 to 3 months. Eventually the water dries up, but frogs and toads are breeding in those areas. So there's a lot of places that you could find around where you may live. Subdivisions are also good places. Sometimes they have retention ponds, and sometimes a retention pond can be a good place. Sometimes they're not. In my neighborhood, we have a retention pond that does have green frogs and bullfrogs living in it, but because people added fish to the retention pond, we no longer have spring peepers and things like that. They cannot survive with the fish predation. And so it did alter it. And sometimes it can alter it to a point where there's no frogs. So some of the types of wetlands, and you'll have resources to go back and review these, but some of the terms in the pull down menu, they'll ask you, do you think it is a marsh, a vernal pool, a swamp, a bog, or a fen? And typically you'll answer the best that you can. These are just some basic definitions, the difference between a marsh and what they consider a vernal pool, which is like water that forms from melting snow rain. It's usually dry in the summer. A marsh is usually an area that's covered in water. It might have some vegetation like a cattail coming up or something like that, versus a swamp. And so there's some different terms out there, and we can help you answer these if you're having issues figuring out. You just do your best to pick one. Another areas that I mentioned, everything from around your neighborhoods can be great sites. Backyard sites are also considered a wetland site. If frogs are coming to your pond and they are breeding, that is considered a wetland site, even though it's man-made, and you'll answer questions about it that is man-made. Or it could be, this is a picture of a retention pond. behind, I think it's Webster University. And so it's another good example of a site that you could choose to monitor. There are, and I mentioned before, if you're having trouble, you would like to monitor one of our sites. Right now, we have 2 sites in Forest Park, and you're welcome to reach out to us and let us know, and we can make some kind of a sheet where we know who's going to be there, and so we can kind of formalize who's stopping by and when. But feel free, if this is an option that somebody wants, reach out to either Carrie and I, and we can give the information of where the locations are for these particular sites. Because of COVID going on, I did want to point out, you want to make sure when you do choose a site that it's safe to do so, and meaning when you're going there, there's not going to be a lot of people around for your protection. Make sure use the safety protocols that you are comfortable using, whether it's a mask or just make sure you're not in large groups. It's becoming better now with vaccination, but it's just something you want to keep in mind. If you happen to choose a site, it probably won't be as big deal at nighttime. There won't be as many people, but just something to think about. So I'm going to go ahead and walk through how to add a site. So give me a second here, and we are going to pull up a website for you, everybody. Okay.
Mike, real quick question that just came up in the chat. Rachel wanted to know if that Webster University site was still available.
It may be, and you can, I'll mention in a minute, you can actually add data to anybody's site. That is, you're able to do so. And what I mean by able to do so, obviously, if it's somebody's backyard site, you cannot add data to their site because you can't get in their backyard. But if it's accessible, you don't have to actually use your own site. There are sites that are still out there where people quit adding data to. That one is available. Yes, it is a site, I believe. If not, we can register a site, but I think there may be a site already. Okay, 1 second, everybody. Okay. Are there any questions, other questions that have popped up? Okay. Okay, and I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to go ahead and walk through this. Okay.
Question, but to let you know that you can select sites, so that's a matter of preference on ease for you. And then also, there is a fabulous site. I don't know where you're located in Illinois, but Mike, do you remember that site that I hosted a training at last year or 2 years ago?
Let me think
The
about
watershed, Illinois watershed nature area.
I think so. Oh, I do know where that is. Let me think about the location, but yes, I know where you're talking about.
We'll find that out, and it's a delightful little area. I highly recommend visiting it.
And there's a lot of places we've talked to that would love to partner with somebody and have people monitor sites. And so some of it's just communication and reaching out, and we're happy to help you. So when you log in, I've logged into my account. The little green thing will pop up so I can add data. So when you click on that, what you get is this particular screen. And so if you wanted to register a site, that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to register a site. I want to add a station. These are other stations that show up down here. Right now, these are previously used stations. These are my previously used stations. So these are sites that I've registered to over the years, or sites that I've followed or add data to. But we're going to add a brand new site. So if I want to add a site, number one, it needs to have the longitude and latitude. And so if I knew about where it was, there's a couple ways to get there, but I can obviously click this and it'll jump to where I am. And then I'm near St. Louis, so I can zoom on in, and it's just using your mouse to move in. And I'm going to actually pick a site. Let's see, a site that I am aware of. Let's go down to Fenton area. There we go. So let's say I wanted to register this particular site. Now, the thing about registering a site is whoever registers that particular site with your account also has the ability to delete that account. Um, Other people can add data, but they can't change stuff in the site, only the original owner. Some of the new parameters that are helpful, which is chapter coordinator. So Carrie and I would have the ability, if you need any help with your site, we can help change or alter things for you if you need be. But typically you're going to move the little black dot over it and you notice that the GPS changes. If I was zooming in here, and this was a great place to pull up and listen to what's calling along the Merrimack River, you would type in here and put a name. What we recommend is you don't use a name that it has anybody's typical name in it. Like you don't want to call it Ron's backyard. We don't want to have the knowledge that this might be somebody's backyard. So you would put some other type of name. So we'll call this River Road. We'll call it River Road. The city, you're going to fill it in. To even though the GPS tells you where it is, you'd want to put a city. So we would put something like Fenton. County is, this one is St. Louis County. State is Missouri. So it's just all fill in. It doesn't take much time to fill it in. Typically, if you start putting in M, it'll fill in itself. Characteristic use. And so this gives you a couple of choices. Is it suburban, urban, or rural? This particular site, off the top of my head, is suburban. The site habitat. So they give you a lot of choices. Is it a swamp, a bog, a freshwater, vernal pool, a wet? In this area, we're going to call it, along that particular spot that I chose, we'll say that there's a pool of water, so we're going to call it a pond. Origin of wetland, we are going to say is not natural. If it overflows, it could be formed by a beaver dam, human, man-made, artificially altered. I'm going to say it's natural. Water is present in this particular spot all year long, so it's permanent. And then water source, we are going to say it comes from the Merrimack River, so it's a stream or river. And then description, you can put whatever you want. You can make this a paragraph if you wanted to, but you could put a little bit where it is or something about it. I don't know what I'm going to put about it. I'm going to leave it blank if you wanted to. And you can put directions to the site. So if you were to register, all you would need to do is hit create, and that is registered. So I'm going to actually create it, and we will go ahead and I'll delete it later, but now I have it here. So when I go back to actually add data to the site, what I can do is I'll have all the different sites. So now these are all my sites, and now there's again, so I could choose this if I wanted to add data. And so we're going to jump back into my presentation for a minute, and we'll come back to this. If I wanted to add data, what would I have to do? So I am going to jump back into.
Mike, while you're doing that really quick, we did have a question
Sure.
from Jack about he had put in observations before, and when he's logging in, he's noticing that 2 of the 3 sites that he observed last year are not listed when he logs in,
Okay.
or are not listed on my login, he says.
Okay. What you could do is send me the name you think of those sites, and I can look into it to see when they updated. It is very possible, and I don't know the true answer, but it's possible something got disconnected to your account. So if there's a site that you're no longer seeing, let me know if you remember the names of the sites, and we can see if we can find those sites and get it added back to your account. So what I would recommend is send Carrie or I an email, and we can look into it individually and see if we can figure it out. That's a good question. I'm sorry that happened. So typically what you're going to do if you want to add data, there are the protocols, and this is the longest part of the training that has to do with protocols. But one of the things that's nice is when you add data, you can do it, of course, on the computer, which means you could take a piece of paper and go out and collect the data that you need to and come back home and go on your PC and put that data in, or on your telephone. And I mentioned the telephone because you can now do it basically in the field on your telephone. If you, of course, have 4G or you have Wi-Fi, but at least 4G, you can actually connect to it and put data in. Now, what it is the website, so it does not have an app. And so one of the things you'd want to know is, well, it's not an app, but the website works fairly well with smartphones and Androids, or any kind of smartphone. So an iOS device, so a iPhone or an Android, it should work. You should be able to open it up. And most people know this, but if not, I thought I'd run through to make it easier for yourself. If you were to open it up and you go on your phone and you search for the website, it'll pull up and it looks just like this on the left. And if you're not familiar with it, on most phones, there's usually either 3 little dots on the top of the website that shows up. And if you click on it, what you can do is you'll get this screen that says add to home screen. So if you click that,
Busy watching my Kindle. I was just watching.
oh, thank you. And if you take a look now, what happens is it pops up and you can name it Field Scope. You could name it whatever you want. But once you add it, you'll now have a little icon on your phone on the front page. And so it makes it a little easier when you're in the field. You don't have to look for it and you can rename it what you want. And when you click on it, all you have to do is log in and it's a live website. So you can now quickly add the data in. Now, because it's a website and not an app, there's a few things when you're doing pull down menus that you need to I call it the fat finger problem. I've had a few problems scrolling down and clicking on the right thing when putting the time on of when your observations are. A few things. It is doable. I've done it a bunch of times now, but it takes a little getting used to. So when you are going to arrive, we're going to go through some of those protocols. So if you've registered a site, you got on your smartphone, or you're going to go out and collect that data and then come back and put it in. There's a few things you would need to do besides learning your frog calls. And so some of them are, you need to make sure the weather conditions are right for monitoring. And so prior to arrival to your site, after you've checked it out, you know there's some frogs there, you want to make sure, and right now I think we're probably pretty good, but the temperature is above 35 degrees Fahrenheit. It is not that some frogs will not move around and some could make a noise, but typically it's so weak, you may not get a very good identification of what it is. And you want to make sure it's not raining too hard and too windy, and it has nothing, not always to do with safety, but what you'll hear, sometimes you'll hear different noises and you may misidentify a frog call because of the wind or the rain. And so it's best, number one, for safety, but also to make sure you hear those frog calls appropriately. So when you're going to arrive, there is some information that you need to collect on every single visit, and it's weather related. And the reason why some of these protocols, they're using them and the way that they're using them is when this program was created in 1998, this is exactly what they followed. And so to make the data set still usable and comparable from data collected in 1998, we still have to follow the exact same protocols. And so typically you're going to collect the data, what the temperature is, the air temperature. Originally, we used to ask people to use a thermometer, and you can if you want to bring your own thermometer. I recommend, to be honest, I use what's on my cell phone or my car. I can see the temperature. It's fairly accurate for what we are collecting. I find it easier just to look on my phone and see what the temperature is. There are sites you can look at. I use AccuWeather on my phone, or weather.com. You can usually get within your pretty close to your GPS area, but AccuWeather is pretty good on your phone to tell you the temperature. You also are going to need to collect what's called the wind speed, and I'm going to go through what the wind speed is. And I have some resources because what they offer through FrogWatch, I've asked for them to update it and they're working on it. I'm asked them to actually put the wind speed next to it. The pull down menu gives you these choices, which is, you can see on the right, the Beaufort wind scale, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And nobody's going to, like it says, number 1, rising smoke. I don't think anybody's going to make a fire out there and see if smoke is rising, but it's based on also wind speed. And I'm going to cover that in a minute. And so you can look up the wind speed and figure out which one it is. But if you look down on this little cutout right here, you notice that it says too windy for monitoring. So they consider a 4 or a 5 rating. And I'll tell you what wind speeds those are. Is typically considered winds moving too much to be able to get a good identification of frogs and toads. And you're going to answer some questions about precipitation during your visit and the past 48 hours and the temperature of the past 48 hours. So this is everything you need to collect as well as what frogs are calling. And so we'll go over that in a minute. When you go to monitor, we always need to monitor 30 minutes after sunset. I don't always look at the exact time of sunset, but make sure the sun's gone down. And it can be any time after sunset up till 1 p.m. I typically recommend nobody goes that late. It's not that you couldn't hear anything, but typically within the time period after sunset up until midnight is more than good enough to hear what frog species come out. I get asked a lot, is it good to move your time around? I think so. I think, for example, if you were to listen at, let's just say 7 o'clock for a couple days, a couple weeks, and then maybe it's 7:30, then maybe it's 8, move it around a little bit. It does increase your chances of possibly, catching a frog species that you missed And that's one of the reasons we go multiple times, is eventually you're going to hear all the species that are there. When you arrive, what they like you to do for protocol is what they consider a 2-minute initiation period. So if you happen to pull up in a car, turn the car off, you're going to want to sit for at least 2 minutes, or if you walk up to an area. And one of the reasons why, and if you ever go looking for frogs, you noticed a lot of times you get close and they quit calling. Usually if you wait around 2 minutes, they're going to start calling again. And so they want you to do about a 2-minute initiation period to wait. And then I recommend, typically you don't have to cup your hands, but it does work sometimes to funnel that sound. But you're going to listen, and what's important, for 3 minutes. What I've done, you can have a timer. I use my cell phone for everything. So I put a timer on my cell phone and just turn it on, and I listen for the 3 minutes. And so I'm going to go through it, but I usually fill out the pull down menus of the weather, and then I turn on my timer. I listen, and then I put the data in for the frogs that I heard and the information I need about the frog's intensity, and I'm done. And I hit submit, and I'm done for that particular observation. So on your phone, we'll talk about it, but the 3 minutes is important. Why it's not 5 minutes is because that was the original protocol, that it was a 3-minute window. And so we want to make sure we do collect 3-minute windows. When you're listening, you'll want to try to remember all the breeding calls that you hear in the session and the call intensity. And I'll talk about the two different things. And it is hard. It takes good practice, but it's not impossible to listen and learn those frog calls. When I first started, I thought I was pretty good with frog calls. And what I learned, I took an online test and I got a 60%, which to me, I was like, I suck. So I went back and I listened and I listened. I got really good. And there's only 10 calls that we're going to go over, and you may not hear all of those ever at your site. You may only have 2 or 3 species. And so it takes a little bit of practice, but you can get really good at identifying your frog calls. And if something were to interrupt your call, I don't know, if a car backfires, I don't know, something, you're basically going to redo your session, wait your 2 minutes, and then listen for 3 minutes, and you're done. So for the most part, as far as if you're all set up, it doesn't take that long to pull up and listen, or if it's in your backyard to listen, it doesn't take a massive amount of time. Usually once you're ready and you have all your stuff ready to go. Some of the stuff they recommend that you might want to bring with you is not required, but there are monitoring protocols, or at least remember what they are. If you want a notepad to jot down some things, a cell phone is good if you're going to be using it. And also if something were to happen, you need to call somebody. I do recommend sometimes if you think it's by yourself in a car, go with somebody. If you want a thermometer, you can, but like I said, I use my phone or a computer. If you happen to be going to a place where it's not your property and you need a permission, I recommend you get written permission. Have somebody send you a letter or an email with a PDF attached that says you have permission to be there. I've been many places where somebody said I had permission and I show up and that person no longer works there. So I recommend please get written permission or some formal permission to go to some particular place you're listening to. Hopefully you never need a first aid kit, but FrogWatch USA recommends, I recommend that. Flashlight is not a bad idea. And amphibian field guide is not terrible, although I won't be reading in the dark, but it's good sometimes to listen to it. Some people like to record the frog calls, and that's okay. The protocols do say we don't want you to record the calls and then go listen to them and then put the data in. We want you to listen live and figure out what those species are. Does not mean you can't record them. Sometimes if I hear things I don't know what they are, I'll write in the notes, heard something, don't know what it is, and I'll take a recording. You are more than welcome. If you hear something you have no idea, send it to me. I'll do my best to get back to you as fast as I can. I love when people send me recordings of species and they're not sure what it is. Frogs and toads do make different calls than just their breeding calls. So this is what it'll look like when you go to put data in. And once again, I'll jump back to that website in just a second and we'll walk through what it's like particularly, it's not that hard, but to put that last bit of information in. But it looks like this particular one, the pull down menus. So let's go ahead and we'll take a peek at it. And okay. And we now, whoop. There we go. Okay, we now should be at that website. Hopefully everybody's seeing the website right now. So let's say we registered this site. It's our first night going out. So I have this chosen. So I'm going to make sure it is chosen. I'm going to add data to that site. I'm going to scroll down here and it says the date. So when you pull it down, I'm going to hit today, auto fills in. The time I'm going to start, I'm going to wait for a second until I get the rest information filled in and I'm ready to go. So air temperature, it is important if you go to put air temperature in here, especially if you're going to use Fahrenheit. It'll tell you if it seems weird. Like if I put in 3, it'll actually sometimes come up that you can't be that, it's too cold. So if you're going to put it in, change it to the degree you're in. Oop. There we go. Fahrenheit. And so you're going to go in, and if it's 60 degrees outside, put in the wind speed. So if I was going to wind speed, if it's, I think it's 5 to 6 miles an hour, it's light and breezy, and you can also use your best judgment. Precipitation during the visit, it is not raining. So I'm going to put none at all. Precipitation in the last 48 hours. Well, we'll say it's been raining some, at least here. And then temperature in the last 48 hours. And the 3 choices are above freezing, below freezing, or not included, or not noted. I'm sorry. So we'll hit above freezing. And now you're going to add the data that you hear. So we're getting ready now to listen to those species. And so I'm going to look at my watch and I'm going to come up here and real quick, I'm going to say, okay, we're going to get ready to start for 3 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and select it's PM and it is 7 o'clock and it's 7:04. And I hit okay. I hit my watch and I'm going to listen for 4 minutes. So while I'm listening, I'm going to be listening for the frog calls that we're going to be going over in just a minute. And we're going to listen for the intensity, and I'll cover that in just a second. So after I've listened for them all, we go through and all I heard was an American toad. So I heard the American toad. And then call in intensity, and we'll get to it and what it means. But I heard, and individuals can be counted. So there's a lot of space in between them. And so I'm going to put that in. And that's it. If I want to add another frog, I heard like 2 different kinds. I'm going to add another one in here. And maybe I heard some spring peepers. And so you can just type in spring and it starts popping up. There it is, spring peeper. You'll notice you have a couple of choices. There's spring peeper southern, spring peeper northern, and spring peeper. I'm going to go over what term we are using, but if you get confused, just put in what you think, and I'll see the data come in, and I can always make recommendations to change it to the, we do not have southern spring peepers here. We have the northern spring peeper. So we'll put that in there, and calling intensity, they were chorusing. There was like a million of them in there. So now we have a 3. And if we're all ready to go, you can always add a few other things. I don't have any notes. All we have left then is to say save observation. And I've now added a data point to it, and I'll go back and later and edit that out. So it doesn't take a lot of massive, I don't think, to put it in there. It just takes a little bit of practice. I'm going to go ahead real quick here, and we're going to jump back in and finish up this section. So some clarifications. I mentioned the wind speed. We'll make sure you have access to this, but these are the actual wind speeds. So for 1 is 1 to 3 miles an hour, a 2 is 2 to 4, and a 3 is 8 to 12. So anything over 12 miles an hour is considered either a 4 or 5 or above. Hurricane is way above that. But it gives you an idea of anything 12 and below is going to be a 1, 2, or 3 or 0. So that's what we're looking for when we put that information in. And it's also somewhat based on what you think it is. Intensity, and this is a very good example. When you intensity, if you hear, for example, no frogs calling, that's a 0. That's an easy one. So if you go to a site early on, and you're just going to have a lot of zeros, there's nothing calling. But an individual can be counted, and here's a good example. These are spring peepers. Hopefully you can hear a couple of them. You can hear spaces, you can count them. This one is more of a 2, so this would be calls can be distinguished, but there's some overlapping. Oop, hold on. You can hear some overlapping. Now the difference would be of a 3, it's gonna get loud, and you're gonna hear so many that you're gonna lose. You're not gonna be able to count. Here we go. And sometimes it's even louder than that. But that should give you an idea of those categories. So I'm gonna stop there before we get into auditory training. Are there any other questions that have come up about the protocols? And you're welcome to go back and review these protocols and go back through them.
There is nothing.
Okay, what I'm going to do, it's a 303. What I think would be appropriate here, let's go ahead and if anybody needs one, let's take a 5-minute break. If you need to run to the restroom, get something to drink or something like that, I think I'm going to go grab something to drink. And we're going to come back and we are going to learn our frog calls. So I'll start again at, let's see, 5 minutes at 3:09, around there, 3:09, 3:10, we'll start again. So while we're waiting for a few people to get back here, if there's any questions so far before we jump into auditory training too, we got a minute or so if anybody's sitting out there that has any questions you'd like to ask. All right, it's getting pretty close here and we'll give everybody a few minutes, but I want to let everybody know that's out there, we are going to be using some polls in a little bit. If you're not familiar, you should have a poll pop up when we put it out there, and you'll have the opportunity to vote on a particular answer. So we're going to try that. Hopefully it'll work out well, but we'll see how it works along with the PowerPoint. The format too, at the end here, we'll turn everything off and turn our cameras on. And if anybody would like to ask questions, you're well and welcome to turn your camera on and your mic on if there's some question you'd like to ask near the end here. I would recommend make sure you have your speakers ready to go as far as if it's too loud or too soft. We are going to be playing some frog calls, so hopefully none of these will be too loud when we first call them, but be aware you may have to change your volume occasionally. So hopefully everybody's back. We're going to now head into frog and toad calls, learn a little bit about the calls and go through some of them and hopefully answer any questions people have. So when you talk about noises that frog and toad make, they make a lot of different ones. And typically it is the males or boys that are making those noises. It's not always. A lot of the different female species have the ability to make noises, but they typically don't have sometimes the anatomy of the full anatomy and or the hormones to be able to create the advertisement breeding calls or want to. But what we're going to be listening to and the calls we're making are highlighted here in yellow are the dominant sounds heard during the breeding season. But if you can look at the list below, they do make a massive amount of other noises. And sometimes I hear noises that I have no idea what it is. It wasn't that long ago, and it's been, I think, several years now, maybe 6 years ago. Somebody sent me a recording that had come to one of our trainings, and it sounded like, and I had no idea what it was. It was not a breeding call I've ever heard, and it turned out it was not a breeding call. It was, and actually the second one on the category there, it was an agnostic call, an aggressive call. It turned out that it was a tree frog, two males fighting over a little, basically a branch. So after the breeding season, a lot of times you may see males fighting over territory. And so you do hear different noises. If you've ever picked up a frog or a toad and you hear it making little chirp-like noises, like if you pick up a male toad, it's called a release call. And it basically means I'm a dude, get off me. And a lot of times in the mating season, males will jump on anything that looks like a toad. And so it's a way for another male to tell them I'm a male, get off. So you may hear that release call. Sometimes they also will do what they call a rain call. It's like the advertisement call. It's not as strong, and you hear it like in the fall. And you're like, what's that guy doing? It's not even breeding time. So sometimes you do hear those. And obviously the alarm call is not universal, but it's very similar to most species. And so a lot of times you'll hear one go, eh! And you'll see all different kinds of species jump into that water. And so they do make multiple calls. So keep that in mind. Now, when you talk about species, this is a picture I took of a bullfrog that we caught. One of the things, if you look really close and you zoom in, this is his tympanum. So this is like the eardrum, if you want to think of it that way, on the surface. And it tells you a couple things. Number one, they've adapted, obviously, for making noises and obviously hearing those noises. Females can also hear. These guys have very large tympanums. And one of the reasons is they want to be able to hear other males in the area. And so they're a little bit larger. Typically males have a larger tympanum, and a good rule of thumb is just visually, if you happen to see one and the tympanum is larger than the eye, and I'm sure it's not true for all species, but for most of the green frogs, bullfrogs, and leopard frogs, if that tympanum is larger than the eye, it's usually an indication of a male. And so it is kind of neat, and we'll get into that. Now, when you take a look, there are generally 3 types of vocal sacs, at least in North America. And so the way I like to think of them is I'm going to start on the right, actually, over here, where it says single external sac. And so you have like a tree frog, has the vocal sac underneath the throat. They blow air vocal cords, and you'll see it if you get close enough. A toad is also a good example of a single external vocal sac, and it resonates that noise. And it can be anything from a trill to a high-pitched noise. And then you have the middle right here, which is also one of my favorites, the paired external sacs. And they're located right near that tympanum. Excuse me. And so they have one on either side. It's 2 of them. and it's like blowing air on balloons on two sides. So you'll see them both inflate, sometimes a little bit off each other, back and forth. A lot of leopard frogs. I think this is a picture of a leopard frog. And then you have a bullfrog, and their external sac is interesting. It's more internal. It's like a frog ate a balloon. And so when they inflate it, it inflates almost their entire head up. And so those are the three major sources. And they can arrange all different kinds of really unique noises, from animals that sound like they're snoring in water to the bullfrogs deep boom that can typically last. I think it can go about a half a mile. And it's a lower frequency. Lower frequency can travel farther. And then you have the high pitched trills of like spring peepers and things like that. So there's a lot of very unique noises that they can make from all these different vocal sac arrangements. Now, there's a lot of factors that influence the call intensity. All of them, the time of year, obviously, as the temperature moves up, the more light, you're going to start getting more species active. The time of day, typically after sunset, around midnight. So that time period is when they call the most, which is why our protocols have people monitor after sunset. It does not mean they won't call outside of those things. As a matter of fact, on a rainy, overcast day, a lot of times they'll call without a problem. However, the protocols of this particular project ask you to monitor after sunset, and that's because that's the most common and the most active time. Precipitation obviously increases. Usually either right after a rain or rain's coming, you'll start to hear frogs and toads call a little bit more. The other one's, of course, temperature. Obviously, colder temperatures, it has a huge effect on the calls, which is why we have that 35-degree bottom mark that we don't want you to observe after that. And it is a huge effect. If they can't produce the full amount of air blowing across, the sound sometimes, number one, make it hard to identify. And sometimes you might misidentify as another species. A lot of times you just don't hear them. They're too weak. And then size of individual is another big effect. And if you're for example, a small toad does not do a very good job of making that call. It sounds kind of like the noises you practice hearing, but it's just not as good. As a matter of fact, the size of an individual is indicative for most females. They can choose which males have the right sound. And if they're large, they're well fed, they're healthy, they make the right pitch. We can't always hear it with our hearing, but females, that's one of the things they're listening for. That's how they choose out the better mate of that case. Doesn't mean if you're a smaller male, the game's over. They have adapted multiple breeding strategies, and one of them you see in toads more often is called satellite males. They actually stay farther away from the pond. They don't waste their time making noises because they're not going to attract a female, and they wait for a female to go towards a male that's at the pond, and they catch them before they get to the pond and kind of escort them to a separate pond and mate. And so there's our other strategies, but typically that size is indicative of sometimes could be health, which is kind of neat. Acoustic interference is a big deal. Car noises and all those different things, wind blowing. It does affect, number one, the calls they are making, and for them to hear it as well. There are some new studies coming out that somewhere in urban areas, frogs and toads have adapted because they can't hear each other to call at different times or call at higher frequencies to be able to hear each other. So we're going to spend some time now looking at we're not going to go through every species, but around our area, there's about 23 species of toads and frogs. And it depends on what we look at, how far away we go from the St. Louis metro area. You're going to pick up more species the farther out we go. But if you were to do a circle around St. Louis and include East St. Louis, I'm going to cover the species that you would most likely find around this area. And we're going to spend time listening to at least the common 10 that have been reported that are most common. If you hear something else, we'll give you resources, but I've not had anybody report that they hear them.
Mike?
Yep.
Real quick, you did have some good questions. Rachel is setting up a frog pond in her yard, and she wondered if it was too late to attract chorus frogs.
Right now they're breeding. So what you may see if you're setting one up, it is possible near the end they may show up, but as far as breeding season, you are in the beginning of their breeding season. So my guess would be they may come to your pond, but they may not breed in your pond this year. That's just my guess. Not impossible. Their breeding season goes from here all the way until April. So I would think at the end of April, it is possible as they move around, some depending on how close your pond would be to another breeding site. It's possible when night's raining, some guy moves over, and they say he starts calling and all the other males show up. It is possible, but my thought would be maybe next year, possibly that they might start breeding. Somebody's moving around during the very beginning and find your pond, and they'll come in your pond even outside of the breeding season. So, good question.
And one other question, Jack wondered when would be a good time to start doing observations in suburban St. Louis, and when do they stop?
Sure. My typical recommendation, if it's depends where, and you can send me a better location. If it's inside the metro area, my recommendation would be April's a good time. Right now, there are a few things calling in the metro area as I have recording devices out, and it depends where you are, which is why I'm trying to collect this data. But southern leopard frogs are definitely calling. Even in like Forest Park, they're calling. But some of the species don't call till April. So like toads are not calling yet. Tree frogs are not calling yet. So if you wait till April and May, and that time period, you're going to pick up more species, might actually hear something. Right now, there are no spring peepers in Forest Park. So if you pick that as the center of the city area, there's nothing calling but southern leopard frogs. If that kind of gives you an idea. If you go farther south in this South County, depends where you are. You might pick up a few other things. Depends on your site. If you go to North County, you'd have to go above 270 that I'm aware of so far to be able to actually hear anything calling as of right now. So I would recommend if you're looking at a site, if you let me know where it might be, I can give you my best recommendation of what time, but probably April. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on spadefoot toads. These are the groups, and I'm sorry, let me go back to these groups. These are the groups I'm going to talk about. Now, we're not going to hear noises from all of these groups, but it's good to know because they do exist around here. So we're going to talk real quick about spadefoot toads, narrowmouth toads, true frogs, true toads, and tree frogs and their allies. So spadefoot toads, we do have them around here. You can find them up in Alton area. So if you're familiar with riverlands, that's an area they show up. They're pretty fossorial, which just means just like the Sicilian, they bury themselves a lot of times in the mud or little tunnels. And they do have a specialized spadefoot toad. Basically, I don't know if you can see in this picture on the left over here, a little hook in there. They dig backwards and kind of dig themselves into the soil. They typically have adapted for the sandy soil along like the Mississippi River system in Missouri. Unfortunately, a lot of those areas over time, because of great farmland, has been turned into farmland and has affected some of their populations. Supposedly, we used to have both these kinds, the spadefoot and the eastern, would meet actually where the Missouri and Mississippi River meets. And so there is a possibility of having possibly both. More than likely, the only one that's probably still around here would be the possibly the eastern spadefoot. I don't know the answer as I've not gotten any recordings of either of these guys. I have been told that there's some possibly in Chesterfield behind the Red Robin out in Farm Field. Some people hear them calling. And we're going to play one of the calls, so maybe you'll hear it when you're out there. It's a species I am interested to find out where they are. Narrowmouth toads, I don't think we have any in the metro area, but I wanted to put it out there. They are unique. I've never actually seen one in Missouri. It's something I'd like to get out and find. They are fossorial. They spend a lot of their times on burrows and stuff like that. Usually wet glades is where you find them, and so we don't have too many left in the metro area. So it is a species that I'm not going to play a call tonight. I don't think you're going to see it, but it's important to know it's out there. If you hear something, you're like, never heard that noise before. It is possible, and I'll have resources where you can listen to calls and go, oh, that's what it is. But I don't think it's one that I think you're going to come across, but I wanted to at least make people aware that there are other groups out there. Now, the next couple of groups we are going to hear and talk about animals in this group. So true toads in our area, as you move out in the broader sense, these are the 4 different species down here. We have a couple different toads. They're real similar looking. The American toad we're going to listen to tonight. The Great Plains toad, I don't think you'll ever hear, but if you go farther west, you sometimes can run into that, depending on how far out you go. Fowler's toad is common around here. The Woodhouse toad you're going to find it farther west, so it is a possibility, but probably in the metro area not. The Fowler's toad and the Eastern American toad are more like what you're going to hear, and this is true for the Illinois side as well. Those are the species you should most likely hear. They're pretty easy to identify, and I'll talk more about the toads when we get to them. True frogs, we have a lot in our area, and true frogs are typically, if you want to call them pond frogs, things you find typically they spend most of their time in the water, web feet adapted for the water. Sometimes these are considered game, at least some of them are game species. But we have the northern crayfish frog, the plains leopard frog, the southern leopard frog, northern leopard frog, green frog, bullfrog, pickerel frog, and wood frog. We're not going to cover every single one of these, but we will touch on most of these in this particular group. But this is about what's around this area. Most of them are very distinctive enough calls. You can tell them apart from each other. Obviously, the leopard frogs sometimes are very similar, and so it makes it pretty hard to tell the difference. And then we're going to get into which is my favorite group, and there's a lot you noticed in this group, and it depends how far away you go from St. Louis, which ones you're going to run into. But I listed them down below. These are all the tree frog allies, including the gray tree frog in our area. So we're going to talk about a handful of these guys, the most common ones you get around here. So with that being said, what I found the most useful is to learn the most common 10. And if you hear anything outside of these, which would be wonderful, and I'm going to mention Ashley at the end too. We're going to list, so total of 12 eventually. But we're going to spend more time on these common 10. These are the ones that are most reported, the ones I come across the most in all the areas, even urban and even on the outside counties. This is what I have seen reported the most. And so that's what we're going to spend our time learning. And if you happen to hear something that's not one of these, like I said, you'll have good resources. Get a recording, send it to me, and I can tell you what it is. So when you look at these guys, I'm going to break them for learning these purposes. We're just going to talk about them in groups of 5. So in the first group, I wanted to pick ones that are very distinctive and easy to compare and easy to identify. So the first one is the bullfrog. The next we're going to learn in a minute, and obviously the American toad. These are a good example, a toad and a frog. And so the American toad is pretty easy to tell it's a toad. It's easy to tell from its call. Bullfrog is also fairly easy to tell from its call. A lot of us have heard all these before. Bullfrog is one of our biggest ones in here. I did put the scientific names in case anybody likes taxonomy, just to make you guys aware. They've done a huge taxonomic change recently. And so on the bottom down here, you noticed underneath these, the ones on top are the old names, the names that I grew up learning. The ones underneath are the new genus and species. What they had found is in Europe, which were the frogs and toads that were identified first, at least in the scientific community, are different genetically than our frogs and toads. And so they were able to keep the original genus of Bufo and Rana for their frogs and Bufo for their toads. And they gave us, the American frogs and toads, new genuses. And so Lithobates is the new genus for all of our frogs. And I'm not 100% sure, but Anaraxis, I think, is the genus for toads. And in this group, we're going to include 3 of the most common around here. So you have the gray tree frog, and you notice it says complex, and I'll explain why. And then there's the northern spring peeper, and then the Blanchard's cricket frog, and you can see the genuses for these particular ones. I have the word gray tree frog complex. There are 2 tree frogs in our area that are very similar looking and sound as well. It's really unique because they are related, but somewhat distantly. One has 3 sets of chromosomes and one has a normal set of chromosomes. But they've adapted to, in some ways, look like each other in sound and in appearance. So they're very unique, and they do live in areas that overlap. And so it is very hard. The difference sometimes is how many trills in a second. There are people that I've met that said by ear they can tell the difference. For the purpose of FrogWatch, you're welcome to put gray tree frog. And there's the option in Field Scope where you can put gray tree frog complex because it is many times so hard to tell apart. And the reason, even from recordings, it's not always as useful if they were not recorded at the same temperature, because temperature, like I mentioned, affects their noises and how many, like the trills per second, can be affected by the temperature. So typically, it's most likely around, if you're like really middle of the city, it's in a gray tree frog. But as you get outside 270, you might start picking up the Cope's tree frog. So many times, if I'm not sure, I just put gray tree frog complex. So an American toad, most common one around here, they lay eggs and strings, I mentioned earlier, and they're almost everywhere. Their habitat range, I find them in places that I don't even see water nearby, but obviously they're reproducing somewhere. But mowed grassy areas, forested areas, wherever there's some moisture and a little pool of water, these guys can survive. They're pretty common. Size-wise, they're medium size of an amphibian. Now, I thought it'd be more useful for this particular training. I'm going to play some YouTube videos just because for memory, it's good to see them calling because it gives you an idea of a picture in your head, what the animal actually looks like and its call. And so this is the American toad. So I'm going to play this in a second. If you look down here, I tried to include, typically they're going to be most active, at least auditory wise, in that March, April, and May time period. Does not mean you will never hear them in February, but pretty rare. It doesn't mean you'll never hear them in January, but more likely this is the time period that they breed. The middle would be the most active time period for this species. Watch him. Watch his throat. He's going to blow up and take a call. There he is. Nice high-pitched trill. So that's what you're looking for that particular animal is a nice high-pitched trill. You sometimes, if you want to wait long enough, you'll see his vocal sac collapses. If you're listening, I usually listen for the break and he takes a breath and he does it again. And so that's a good example. If you're listening, that's the noise they make and that's what they look like calling if you were to put a flashlight on them. Oop. Now the next one is a bullfrog, and this is a picture I have to point out. My wife helped me take. So this is a picture of my wife. If you take a look, it's a good example. If you ever wonder how you tell the difference between a green frog and a bullfrog, I'm just going to point it out right here. If you can see my little pointer, that little fold of skin around the ear, that's a good indication that this is a bullfrog because all the other true frogs, this fold of skin does not go around the ear. It goes from where the eye is all the way, either stops here or goes all the way down the back. Bullfrog is the only one that has it wrap around that ear. And if you look, that's a tiny little tympanum. And that's a good chance it's either very an immature, male, or it's a female. I'm not 100% sure, but it's definitely not a large adult male. These guys are also, really common. You find them everywhere. As a matter of fact, it's one of the most dominant frogs in urban parks because they can take over. They can handle more pollution. So I find them almost everywhere. They are considered somewhat of a game species. A lot of people used to buy bullfrog tadpoles, so sometimes they've ended up all over the place, unfortunately. They're still a unique frog, and their call is pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and call this. You notice right here on here, you're not going to start hearing them till May. Sometimes I don't hear them till June, but I have heard them at the end of May, somewhere in here between June, July, and August, sometimes even into September. But they're pretty much a summer species. Watch this guy. There you go. And that's a pretty good example right there of that inflated internal pouch. Good example. You hear that some people use the term jagorum, but it does travel pretty far, and that's their particular call. Now, peepers is one that I find fascinating. We'll get into it. They're pretty tiny. These guys, as they get bigger, they'll be about the size of maybe almost your pinky size. When they're first born, and the first year, I've seen about the size from your knuckle out to the end of your pinky. They can pretty small. But they can make an amazing loud noise. They are, of course, in that tree frog family. If you look at the toes on that little picture there, they're not suction cups. They don't stick as well as a tree frog, but they are related. So they do have toe pads. They just don't stick and hang on. So they typically stay in that low vegetation along water areas. They typically like ponds that are shaded on one side and sun on one side. So usually a pond that backs up to a wooded area is where I see them most often, but they can breed almost anywhere that is an ephemeral pond with no fish in it is one of the important ones. Now, one of the things I've noticed in all the searches I have in our area, I have found a more common, which is neat, in the North County area and South County area where I find sinkholes. And the reason that may be is because those areas hold water, but they drain out quite a bit. So fish don't establish. And these guys, all they need to do is breed and metamorphosize within a month or so, and they're out. And so they don't need water standing all year long. And they spend a lot of time actually outside of the water in wet leaf litter. And their call is also pretty unique. Now you notice in here, this is a February frog. These guys come out early. including, we'll mention some other ones, but this is a really early breeder. And if you see anything that sounds like birds, there you go. Sounds like a bunch of little birds at nighttime. That's a spring keeper call. There he is. Beep. That's a good example of what that call sounds like. A nice quick peep, and you can see that it makes that note, his little vocal sac, beep. And that's what they sound like. When it sounds so like a jingle bells, is because there's like hundreds of them making the same noise. And then there's the cricket frog. In our area, we have what they call the Blanchard's cricket frog, which used to be considered a subspecies. But on our menu, you can put in, I believe it says Blanchard's cricket frog on a field scope. They typically have a lot of green or more green on them. And if you look on this picture, there's green down the back. Sometimes I've seen green dots. I have found ones, however, that are barely any green at all on them and are brown. But in our typical area of Missouri on the Illinois side, we have what's called the Blanchard's cricket frog. Range in size, and you can see that up to about 1.5 inches. So maybe the full size, at least the largest one I've ever seen, is maybe like almost size of your ring finger. What's neat about the cricket frog, their legs are really large. These guys jump really fast, which is one of the ways that I think they might have gotten their name. I couldn't find any literature, but they do jump like a cricket. They're hard to get a hold of. So if you find a small little frog, and you're like, a lot of times I find them in flooded areas reproducing, but I find them a lot during the rest of the year down rivers, creeks, gravel bars. You'll see little frogs, and you go to catch one, and then they rocket away. Usually their nose is a little pointy, or typically it's probably a cricket frog. Their call is very distinctive. These guys are doing pretty well around our area. Once again, it's a little bit later. It's not a February beginning call. So now you're like an April, like a toad. That's around when they start calling. These guys will start calling. Still early. Make like a clicking noise. You'll hear the other one in the background, and that's what most of these frogs do. When they hear another male, they're going to call. It's like a calling competition. And then the last one in this group, this is the gray tree frog. Now I picked this picture, if you notice, is gray, but he's green. It is true that most of these guys are gray, but a lot of them will be green in color, especially when they're born. I have lots of pictures of them when they're younger, and sometimes they just have a lot of green on them, green and brown. The way I know it's not a green tree frogs we have in Missouri. Most of them are south of us, down to the Boot Hill. It's not impossible that you would hear one, depending on how far out you go from St. Louis. But visually, their sound, or so visually, they have a white stripe, a blaze that goes down the side of their body. So visually, they're easy to identify. And sound-wise, they don't sound the same as a gray tree frog. So if you were to hear something that sounds nothing like what we're hearing tonight, it could be something else. But I'm going to go ahead and play it. These guys have adapted very well to people. I don't think they'll go extinct anytime soon. And the reason they do spend a lot of time up and down trees, obviously, you can even hear them in the springtime moving their way down, where you'll hear them, up in the middle of the tree. It's getting close to April. Pretty soon they're like at the base of the tree, and then pretty soon they're on the ground. So you can hear them calling as they make their way around, and they use everything around people to echo. I have found them in fence poles, like metal fence poles, echoing inside. Obviously, they'll breed in, water barrels in your backyard, pools. Some people find them obnoxious. I think they're really cool. They're a very unique frog, and they've done very well around people. And the reason is they'll use things like houses and brick walls to echo their sound. So I'm going to go ahead and play it. Here we go. Most people have heard this noise, even if you live in the city. So those are our first 5 frogs. Now, before I move on, how many, hopefully out there, you think you might be able to remember those 5 calls, because we're going to play some noises and actually put some polls out and see how well we can do. It's anonymous, so nobody will know. So feel free to guess and see how well you do. So we're going to play a game in here in a minute, and I'm going to launch a poll in a second. I'm going to play the calls, and this first one, just to test your knowledge, it's going to be one of these three. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll see if the technology works for me. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll play the call and I'll launch the poll here. Oop, give me a second. There we go. I'll launch the poll. Those are your three choices here. So let's see, hopefully the poll shows up for everybody. If you'd like to try to go ahead and guess what it might be.
I think we have some experts in here, Mike. They're doing great.
So I made this too easy. Well, I'll have to make it harder in a minute. All right, so it looks like almost everybody picked cricket frogs. That is correct. That was a cricket frog. So, yay, you got it right. You can hear that nice staccato noise, like tick, 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 tick. All right, we'll play the next one here. Looks like the poll worked. That makes me happy. We launched the new poll.
Looks like we have some good answers again.
All right. Very good. You guys did great. So if you take a look at those particular calls here, you are definitely hearing, and I will show you what it is. We have most people pick toad and great tree frog, which are very similar to each other. You got that trill. That particular one was that great tree frog that was calling. And you notice I spelled it wrong down there. Well, not wrong. There are people who spell it gray, but it should be Gray. You can definitely pick that particular one out. Whether or not it was a great tree frog, I believe it is. But obviously, if you were to put great tree frog complex, you'd also be correct. We'll go ahead and play this one, and I'll launch this one. And we did really good. Once again, it's that nice high-pitched trill. This one is an American toad that was calling. Obviously, some of the other choices out there, the spring peeper is a high-pitched noise, but it is more of a bird sound. That was actually a good example of a toad calling. And if you were to look at this graph that I put in here, you can see that the break right here, that's when he took a breath. That was a, and then he started again with his vocal sac. But great, you guys are doing fantastic. Now it gets harder as you go along. And so those were individual calls. So this next question we're going to play in here is, and I'm going to read it out loud so it makes it easier to answer. I'm going to ask you how many different species, and this could be and or toads or frogs, do you hear calling? So not which ones, but how many different kinds, if you want to think of it that way, that you hear calling. And so I'll give you a poll in a second. So it's going to be a number.
They're doing great again.
They are doing very good. Now with frog calls, I want to point out, this is something that I have noticed when you're listening to them, it is hard sometimes to tell how many kinds, and then because when you do frog watch observations, you got to listen which ones are out there. You have to figure out which ones they are and their intensity. And so it takes a little bit of practice. And as you get older, it gets harder. At least I've noticed my hearing has changed over time. And it's fun when I go out, my wife, we listen for frog calls. A lot of times I'll pick up species she may not hear until we're closer. And it has to do with hearing damage. And as ears age, you don't always pick up all the frequencies. So sometimes it can be harder depending on how close you are to those frog calls. And then you add in, several kinds calling. And these were individuals calling because I made these tracks. But when you add in 50 of each species calling and you add in some insect noises and a car noise going by, it takes a lot of practice to, tease out in the background and identify which frogs are calling. For me, I find it a lot of fun. It is good practice and a lot of fun. But the answer to that particular one was 3. There were 3 species or kinds that were calling. So the question, there's no poll for this one, but go ahead. You guys heard it. I'm going to play it one more time. Go ahead in the chat function and type in which species do you hear calling based on the ones we've heard so far.
Getting some great answers again.
All right. Well, let's see if you're right. I'm going to show you the answer and then you can test yourself if you're right. So what was calling there was the American toad, cricket frog, and spring peeper. I know because I made this track. That's why I know what's calling there. It is very possible sometimes when different species call at the same time on top of each other, you can hear noises that aren't there. And so sometimes when I'm not sure, if you ever send me a recording, I can graph it and I can tell you what species are there because their frequencies will show up and I can identify which species they are. But it just takes good practice. And that's why we listen for that 3-minute window. So you can actually better identify which species are there. So we're going to move on to the last set, at least the last 5 that we're going to learn this afternoon. And so the first group we're going to talk about in this one, you'll see we have the Fowler's toad. So we have a different toad. Sometimes can look very similar. This particular picture looks a little bit different. And then we have has been renamed the boreal chorus frog. And so formerly called the Western chorus frog. And so it's what's interesting is some genetic work has re-identified and shifted around some of these particular species. And this is one of those species. So some of our literature, at least some of our observations, used to list it as Western chorus frog. It didn't change the frog that we have here. It just changed what we're calling it. And so when we go to pick it, it's a little bit different. And there's the pickerel frog, which is unique, and we're going to listen to it. It has a funny noise. I won't tell you what it is until we hear it. And then the last 2 large ones, we have the green frog and we have the southern leopard frog that we're going to wrap up with. And once again, take a look that the scientific name is changed. So depending on what you look it up on. What I have tried, and somebody asked me this a while ago, we are trying to follow what Missouri Department of Conservation and or the Illinois side, or at least conservation people are calling their frog species to be as consistent as possible in our area. A lot of sources, at least outside of our area, or national sources may not use the exact terms, but it's the same species. So the Fowler's toad, visually, if you take a look, usually has more distinct blotches on their back with like a white ring around it. Sometimes a greenish in color. I find them sometimes more often in sandy areas, gravel bars, versus the open grass. But their call is definitely different. They do burrow down sometimes a little bit, makes them a little harder to find. But if you take a look at this particular call, it is distinct. It has like a wah noise, like somebody stepped on a toy. These guys do come out, if you look in here in March, almost the same time as our American toad. Almost a little earlier. So instead of that high-pitched trill, it's a little bit different noise. But distinctive enough that you hear it, you're like, huh, sounds pretty funny. The chorus frog is one that I'm actually becoming more and more interested in the areas that I've looked at, where I'm looking if, chorus frogs, spring peepers, and cricket frogs are still in that metro area, at least where they might be. We are not detecting now. We've only been surveying for a couple of weeks, but we're not hearing a lot of chorus frogs at the sites we're looking for. A few of the sites, we've heard some spring peepers down in the South County area. But this one is not showing up as much. And so hopefully the population are doing well. You do find them, of course, many other places outside the core of the city, but they are a kind of unique animal. The call that they make, which is neat, is like, to me, like a rain stick. Some people like to use the term, are you running your finger down a comb? And these guys, once again, this is one of our early breeders. And so you're going to hear it at the same time, and many times the same locations as you hear a spring peeper, you'll hear these guys. They are quieter, so sometimes the sound gets overshadowed by some of the louder noises. So it's distinctive enough, but as you can imagine, as you add a lot of louder noises, it's easy to not hear it, or it disappears in the background. Now, when you get into some of our larger frogs in here, and this is a green frog, and if you look many times, there's a photo I took, I can't remember where, very similar to a bullfrog. And size-wise, it's like a small bullfrog or a smaller. They don't get as large, but if you look, there's that lateral line, and it goes way past that ear. And when you add mud and duckweed and stuff like that, I have a hard time telling until I can get a little closer to them. And a lot of times you'll see a little bit of green, not always, but sometimes you'll see them right on that mouth area. But similar enough that many times they get misidentified, at least visually, as a bullfrog, but they're found many times the same place. They usually like shallow water, so you find them in ponds and lakes and things like that. Pretty common in our forest park area and a lot of our other urban parks. Now, their call sometimes can sound like a banjo string, they'll have individual bow, bow noises, and sometimes it has a sound like a rubber rubbing a balloon, or a real raspy sound. If you look in here, just like that bullfrog, it's a lot later. So this one pushes it, at least on this map, a little earlier, but I'll be honest, many times I don't hear them until June, but it could be May, end of May, June, July, and August and September. So they're a later summertime breeder. And this is a good picture if you saw that tapanum larger than the eye, like a male. Good example. And then I think this will be the last one in our group, is the pickerel frog. You notice in this one, you can tell it definitely looks like a leopard frog, or in that group. What you'll notice is his blotches, if you notice a little square, almost like camo, like very distinct and in order. They're not all over the place, almost in rows. And so they are distinctive looking when you see them. The pattern usually stands out. And the call is unique. Number one, it's going to be a little bit earlier. And so they're not necessarily the late summer breeder. Like that southern leopard frog, they're early in that time period. They're earlier callers. I'm going to go ahead and play this one. It is a neat fact that they're typically unappetizing to most predators, and so they're a little more toxic than other ones. I only know this. I put this in here. Secretions can kill other frogs that are kept in the same collecting container. It was told to me by somebody. I was out looking. I know it sounds weird, but I was out looking for sedges. I like, rushes and cattails and sedges, and I ran into an agent that was out in the area I was in, and he asked me if I was gigging and looking for frogs, which I was not at the particular time, but he recommended if you catch one of these guys and you put him in with your other frogs, the toxins can transfer to those animals and make them, if you're eating them, unpalatable. So it is interesting. I've never heard of anybody having issues on your hands, but good to know that they're a little more toxic than other species. So their call, and this is a good picture. You see those blotches, very distinct looking. This is, like I said, a little bit earlier. So it's not like the February early, but you're like April time period calling. It sounds like an animal to me snoring in the water. Watch the couches. You can hear the peepers in the background on that call. Some people say like a chainsaw, especially when you get a bunch of them. And then our last one, I'm sorry, this is the last one we'll wrap up. And this is a photo I took and actually an area I live. And this is a pretty good example of a leopard frog, at least a southern leopard frog. If you look, number one, look how pointy his nose is. Very distinctive of most leopard frogs. There's that lateral line. His is actually pretty high up behind his eye and all the way down the body. And most of our leopard frogs, you can see, have green blotches. This one definitely green around some of the little things down his back. This one I'm not sure in this particular one that I caught, either a young one, it could be a female. but a good example or specimen of this particular species. You find them almost everywhere. They're early breeders. So right now, they're even in Forest Park calling. We've had them come into the zoo, so they do move around across roads quite a bit, moving from site to site and ditches. And so they've adapted quite well to around people. Their call is very unique and actually one of my favorite ones because they sound like somebody laughing at you. So if you go ahead and we'll play this one, but it is a kind of a raspy noise. There it is. You'll notice that sometimes they make two different noises, that throaty and then the laughing noise. So sometimes it sounds like two different species, but it's the same one. But pretty distinctive when they make that laughing chuckle noise. So hopefully from those, I know this is kind of a quick introduction if you've never heard of these frog species, but we've now added 5 more on top of the original 5, and this is when it starts to get more challenging. And it's not that all of these would ever call at one time because they choose different habitats, different ponds have different species because they have different requirements, but many of these would call sometimes at the same time, which is helpful in the process of elimination. You hear one, they come out at a certain time and live in certain places. Sometimes you figure out what the other one may be based on the time and the habitat. So I'm gonna go ahead and play this one and we'll launch our poll here and see if you guys can guess what it is. You're doing pretty good, Carrie.
Yeah, they're still doing great.
So that was indeed the Fowler's toad. So if you heard that wah noise, that's exactly even the graph what it looks like. Wah. And that's this little particular frog toad species here. Let's go ahead and try another one here. So you guys did really well. So I'm looking at your answers and everybody picked 2 that are sometimes can be confused with each other. So you picked leopard frogs. We know it's not a toad. So you guys did really good. And some people picked pickerel frog. One of the things I want to point out, number 1, we heard that chuckling noise, which is very distinctive of that southern leopard frog. But also in the background, there was spring peepers. And so number 1, it helps me point out, I hear spring peepers. What other frogs call during the same time period? And leopard frog is an early breeder. And so that's one of those ones. And so sometimes you can use both of the different species calling. And so if you look, here's what the graph looks like. But very, very distinctive chuckling noise. You guys are doing fantastic. And we'll play our last one here. Here's our last poll. Let's see. Yay! Everybody got it right. Fantastic. And that was a good example of a chorus frog. That's exactly what they sound like. Now, those were all the species that I wanted to cover, the most common 10. And it gets obviously harder when you hear field recordings. And so I do have access, and you're going to have access to listening to lots of field recordings, people walking by, listening to noises, and you get really good at listening to those recordings. Obviously, I pulled a few from YouTube just because it's a great way to hear a live animal and other noises in the background, because that's what they sound like in the wild. but it does take good practice, and it's a lot of fun. So there are two more that I'm interested in, and I mentioned these earlier. The eastern spadefoot toad and the wood frog is one that I'm interested in. So I wanted to at least give a little information about both of these. I mentioned earlier the little spadefoot toad. Here's what a map typically looks like. He's one that would come up that Mississippi River. The plain spadefoot comes along typically along the floodplain that you would find more along the Missouri River. Their call is pretty unique, and so I wanted to definitely spend some time listening to him. It sounds like that they use the word "arr, arr," and it's a pretty funny noise. At least makes me laugh. And that's actually what they sound like quite a bit. A lot of times they're in burrows making that noise. Pretty unique noises. If you hear anything that sounds like that, sometimes like a bleeding sheep almost, it may be one of our spadefoot toads. So keep an ear out. Maybe you'll hear one and we'll get some observations on a map for these particular species. Wood frog is unique, and it was one that used to be considered endangered. Now I think it's threatened depending where you look, or it's been downgraded to species of special concern in our area. But I know MDC is always interested. I know they're up in the Rockwoods Reservation area. There's a few places. I've seen an actual one at Columbia Bottoms, which is near the zoo's new property. They're actually considered the smallest of the large frogs, or true frogs. If you look, can't quite tell, but these guys aren't very large. They look just like, you know, the shape and the body shape of a green frog. A lot of times they'll have a patch of a dark right here behind the eye. Although somebody sent me a photo yesterday of one that was, the whole frog itself was almost reddish in color, which was unique. I've never seen that color pattern on the wood frog. Their noise is very unique. It's something I'm always interested in. Some of these particular species can be more susceptible to habitat changes and things like that. But I love to know where these guys might be at least in the reference to metro area. So go ahead. This is an early breeder. So this guy's going to come out. It has a very short window. So the same time peepers come out and chorus frogs, the difference is usually within 2.5 weeks, he's done. So I miss them a lot of times when I want to go out and try to find these guys. The window, we might have already missed the window from when these guys are breeding, unfortunately. So maybe in next year, unless you see them visually, their breeding season is very, very short. Somebody will put a raspy quack. Sometimes sound like little ducks in the distance. So that's that particular noise, and if anybody happens to see one, you can go back and listen. But those are two species that I'm very interested in listening to. Now, there's one more last thing I'm going to wrap up to talk about for the end of the training today. Is we are looking forward to, if people would like to become certified volunteers, and what the difference is that there's an auditory test you could take, and so like many other online resources. You can practice and you can take a certification, and we'll tag your observations. It doesn't mean if you're not certified, your observations aren't useful, because all of them are useful. And we want as many observations as possible, but it does mean that we know that you can identify, I think it's 80% or more of your frog calls. And then you also know the protocols. And so if it's something anybody's interested in, we will offer, it's an online certification. We'll make it active. I think typically we'll make it active in May. So after you've had a chance to practice all your frog calls, or if you're interested, email me. And if you say you're ready to go, I'll send you the link. But it's something that we do ask, and we try to get more certified volunteers out there, just to take obviously another step of making sure you're really good at those frog calls. But there's a volunteer training assessment and a frog and toad identification assessment. And the difference is one asks questions about the protocols, make sure you know that it's not a 20-minute window you're listening, it's a 3-minute window. And then the frog and toad call identification, just test you on the calls of what we just heard here. We may throw an insect call in there just to see if you know it's not one of the frog calls. But almost all of it is just frog calls, and make sure you can identify all the sounds and stuff around our area. So if anybody has an interest in that, feel free to reach out. It will be a place where you could go on your own and register and take the certification if you're interested. So what I recommend, hopefully you guys found, number one, the information and the training useful, and you can go back. Like I said, we're recording this and we'll play it again. Carrie had mentioned, I'm going to show you some resources where you can go and listen, but you practice your calls, review those protocols, and if you need to reach out and need some help registering a site, let us know. But there are some places that you can go, and I'm going to mention some of our new volunteer resources. Number one, this is one that we've created, and we keep adding resources to this. It is a website. Right now, I'm going to be honest, I don't know why, and if anybody's out there has any information that might help me, but when you search for it on Google, you can't find it. But if you type in www.FrogWatchstl.com, it pops right up. So right now, it's not necessarily 100% searchable, although I made it open to the public. It's a good website, and I'm going to jump to it in just a second so you can kind of see what it looks like and what the resources are. So I'm going to to it. So this is our website here. And there's a lot of obviously stuff on here, but if you want to go back and check it out, it's hopefully not too hard to remember. So if you just remember www.FrogWatchstl.com, you can find it. You just got to type it in the URL bar up here. It'll show up. If you put it in the search, it will not show up. There's everything in here. It talks about if you want to know more about FrogWatch Lite and what that project is and what it's about. Just a different way to help, and a different way takes less time and less involvement. If you're a volunteer, you came to the volunteer service, everything in here for everything you need to know about a volunteer. Presentations and handouts, all the presentations in here, we update them. You can go back through and you can watch them online again. And so there's a way, this one we're going to remove because I need to go back and update that real quick. But everything else is the same in here. There's a link in here for certification if you want to get certified, links to social media. And if you want to practice your frog calls, we do have different videos embedded in here, and you can go through and practice. Yes.
We aren't seeing your screen anymore.
Oh, uh-oh. Hold on. Give me 1 second. I will share my screen again. Sorry about that, folks. Thank you for letting me know. Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, let me see. Let me see. Oh, wait a minute. It's this one. Hold on. Can you see it now? There we go. What did you see? I'm sorry. Did you see FrogWatch Lite?
We just saw a blank screen.
Oh, so I've been talking. Okay. So I'm sorry about that, folks. So if you take a look here, this is the home page. When you go here, there's information about FrogWatch and FrogWatch Lite. If you want to go back and read it, what the difference is, and everything about that particular option, or at least activity you can get involved in. If you're a volunteer, these are all your different choices. So you can read more about being a volunteer. There's presentations and handouts in here. So you can go back and at your own time and leisure, go back and rewatch all of these presentations. And these are PowerPoints. You can just click through them. We will also put a link on here for the presentation today. So you could actually rewatch it today if you wanted to. If you decide you want to become a certified, you can click on here and you can actually register and take the certification when you think you're ready. If you want to practice your frog calls, we have links in here and you can sit and listen to the frog calls. More information about each group. You can go back and learn them and listen over and over again. If you want to practice your frog calls, there are some practices down here, some information about the breeding time when you're most likely to see some of these guys, other nighttime calls and other animals you might hear in those time periods. If you want to test yourself, there's actually a link here to species identification practice, and you can just practice getting good at it. So if anybody's interested, check this site out. We also have a Facebook page, and so I'm going to jump back to our presentation here. But you do obviously, of course, have some online resources. But if there's anything else that we can help you with on resources, just let us know. If you're able to follow us on Facebook, it's something you social media follow. We do try to let people know what is happening, around the city, what people are hearing, links to new trainings and other resources. So if we update something on the website, we'll put it on there. But it is a quick way. And if anybody's able to make posts, it's a great way to share. Our city's large, so it's hard to meet in one place, but it's a great way to see what's going on in North County, South County, and what frogs and toads at a park that you're hearing. If there's other frog related activities, we will post them on our Facebook account. And if you have follow Twitter, we'll post them there. So if we hear that there's a frog watch, even if something I'm not doing, but there's an opportunity, you can sign up and we know about it, we'll try to post it on there. So if there's any other opportunity, it's something we'll put on there. So that is the end of our training. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and I'm going to turn on my camera. Does anybody have any questions? We'll turn this session now into a Q&A. And if anybody'd like to unmic and ask a question, feel free.
Mike, really? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mike, one of the questions I put in earlier, is there an app for frog sounds?
There is an app. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I've never used it. It's a one you have to pay for.
Okay.
I've never used it to answer your question. I have to look up what it is. I'm not off the top of my head. I don't know what it is.
Okay,
But
thank you.
there is one out there. If I find it, I'll post it. Carrie, you said there was some questions posted.
There were some in the chat and some that were unique that I could not answer. There was a question about if there has been any known frog or toad preferences for flowers, or if they were to plant certain flowers that could attract insects maybe that are of preference to frogs and toads.
That is a good question. I have no idea, but my answer would be the only thing I think would attract anything that is going to attract a lot of flies and or gnats or small insects. I think you would have a chance of attracting, frogs and toads if there's a water nearby. If they're breeding them, most of them are eating and eat usually aquatic insects. Toads would be the one that I would think to be most attracted if it's a low growing, because they don't climb. If it was a low growing plant that's attracting them, but most of them are eating around nighttime. So it would be more likely a plant that blooms late in the evening or into the later time. You might be able to attract some. So the answer to your question, I have no idea, but I would think anything that's low growing and blooms in nighttime attracts small pollinators or something like that. You may increase your chances of having something that could attract a toad.
We also had a question, and I know that we've had this one before, about Herp Mapper, if we've ever heard of that, and do we
Yes.
use that?
I have heard of it and I do use it personally, but it's not part of FrogWatch, but it is something that I'm aware of. And anybody's welcome to, if you see observations that you're collecting for this project, to also put in Herp Mapper. Right now, there's not a collaboration that I'm aware of between Herp Mapper and FrogWatch USA. And so right now our chapter is not necessarily involved, with cross putting data in two places, but I am aware of it.
Mike, will different species of tadpoles live in the same vernal ponds or backyard ponds?
Yes.
Or do they predate? Do they fight each other?
They do. The answer is yes. You will have multiple species in different in all kinds of ponds. Obviously, there's a disadvantage depending on what species are there. So if you don't typically find, for many reasons, like spring peepers breeding where bullfrogs breed, being that those tadpoles, because they take 2 years, will eat them eventually. And so there is that competition, and they get eaten by a lot of things, which is why it's important as food chain goes. I didn't know this till recently, but I've been doing a lot of salamander projects. A lot of salamander species eat frog tadpoles. And so they'll breed in the same place, and the salamander larva will actually eat chorus frog tadpoles and spring peeper tadpoles when they both metamorphosize in the same location. But they can survive. A lot of them are sympatric. A lot of them are eating similar food, and they come out when the food comes out, and that's why the timing's off on a few of the species. You notice that a lot of them are shifted where you have some that come out in January. I'm not January, I'm sorry, February, March, and then there's a little bit of break, and they've adapted a little bit the April a little bit later. And that's because they're laying eggs and those eggs are hatching and the tadpoles are different sizes. And so the competition is reduced in a few of those places, but you definitely can have multiple species in a pond area.
And what eats toads? Every once in a while, I'll find a toad, like an American toad, in my backyard that's half eaten. Is it
Yep.
like a raccoon?
Most likely
or-
it's a raccoon or an opossum. More
Gotcha.
likely a raccoon. If you ever find one and the belly's missing, but the top is still on, a lot of raccoons have figured out not to eat the parotid glands on the back. And so I don't know how they do. They flip them upside down and they rip open the belly. So if you do find one half chewed, it's more likely a raccoon.
Mike, we have some good questions in the chat. We had a question earlier, and I may have not identified correctly, but we had a question that somebody saw a very small reddish rusty colored toad. And what is that?
Sure. And so it's just a color morph, if you want to call it that. And I've seen quite a few of those. I think they're really cool. Forest Park has about 50 to 60 of them that I've seen in Kennedy Woods. More likely it's a gene that is floating around small populations, but I find it's really unique. It's not unusual, but I find it a unique coloring pattern. Frogs and toads, they come in a lot of different shades, and in certain areas you'll see just different color morphs in some areas. And I have myself seen that red toad, and I think they're neat. I don't think it's anything as far as an adaptation it's not considered a subspecies or anything in our area. I think it's just a coloring pattern, just like a lot of the cricket frogs come in everything from all brown to brown with green, and same with tree frogs come in almost all kinds of colors. And that's what my understanding is, but they're pretty unique. I'm glad you saw one. I think they're neat.
We also had some questions about what are the next steps now that they've taken this training and they are interested in either doing FrogWatch or FrogWatch Lite.
So the next step would be to, if you're interested in FrogWatch, what we talked about today would be to register a site. So to go on FieldScope and make an account. And then the next one would be to start looking around. If you want to register your own site, looking in your area, your neighborhood area, where a good site might be, and looking at those parameters and where it's safe to go to. I can monitor it a half an hour after sunset. And so I usually look for spots, as I mentioned earlier. Maybe you could pull your car up in a parking lot, roll your window down, because we're not asking anybody to go out near water. You just be able to hear them. A great example would be I have a retention pond in my neighborhood and I can walk around it. Obviously, I can sit and listen to some of the frogs there, but my neighbor has some kind of small pond that I can hear from the little walking trail. It's close enough that I can hear peepers calling. And so I marked on the map his pond, gave it a name, and every time I walk my dog, I can sit and listen to it. And so I've found a spot and I can now put it on the map. So you want to register a site. If you don't want to register a site, but you still would like to help monitor a site, to reach out to either Carrie and I, and we can give you some locations. Right now, we have 2 sites in Forest Park. We're working on some more. We don't have any other registered chapter sites, but we can tell you where you can pull up and where to listen. If you're interested in frogs and toads, but you don't have time to monitor a site and you just want to help collect data, because we need to know where these frogs and toads are, but you don't have time to monitor a site for a couple months. If you want to go on iNaturalist and actually make an account, and we have information about that on that website, you can do that. And if you ever see a frog, take a photo or record a call and put it on iNaturalist, and it'll become part of our project. And also I use those calls for trainings like this. And so you can listen to somebody else's call. It's a great way to learn your frog calls. If nothing else, if you happen to hear somebody that talks about frogs and wants to get involved, let them know about our project. Word of mouth is definitely helpful.
Mike,
Yes.
just wanted, I had mentioned to you and had sent you an email, just so people know, sometimes a chipmunk will eat a frog. If you remember.
Yes, that photo blew my mind away. I never thought a chipmunk would eat a frog, but obviously they do.
And a question, has anybody been finding physical abnormalities in frogs or toads due to chemicals in the water?
The answer is yes, but not locally here. But it has very common in different places in the United States. I have not seen anything in the last at least 10 years or more of anybody reporting anything where we live, so the metro area. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I have not seen. And when I mean seen, nobody has reported any physical things that they could see on the outside. Doesn't mean like, something could internally be wrong with them, but I have not heard or seen anything published about any physical things like extra legs or anything like that in our area. That's a good question.
We had a great question about salamanders. Rachel asked if there are any salamanders above 270 where the spring peepers are absent. And also, Rachel, just to shout out that I also have loud children. So if you unmuted, we are completely understanding of that.
So above 270, so if you were to go up like Florissant, Ferguson, and Spanish Lake and those areas, the answer is yes. They're harder to find. I can tell you just because I've been helping the St. Louis Zoo survey the new property that they have purchased up there, and we're working on becoming the new wild care park. And some of the sinkholes that are on that property, we have found salamander larvae and adult salamanders. So my guess would be in the Spanish Lake area, there's probably some, and there's lots of, communities that live around there with some of those sinkholes, which have water occasionally, they drain in and out. Columbia Bottoms, I know, has salamanders. And so, yes, there are some in those areas. It just depends where you're looking, but the answer would be yes.
I think that's most of the questions in the chat. I did just want to throw out on a personal note that if you have small children at home, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that Frog Watch would be a wonderful activity for small children, but my son has latched on to it quite some. By the way, he says hi, Mike. And it was actually really fun to go and take them and listen. We just did it in the car over by Creve Coeur Park, and it was a lot of fun, and they really got into it.
I have found recently with being able to put data in on your cell phone, for me has made it a lot quicker and a lot more entertaining. I mean, and I didn't have to record on a piece of paper like we used to. The program has changed a lot. When I first created the chapter, I used to have to hand put in everybody's data. They'd actually like write it out on a piece of paper and then give it to me, and I'd have to sit and type it in. Then they had the ability to put their own data in. And now we've finally got the ability to put it online while you're in the field. And so I think it's going to make it a lot easier for many people to participate and actually put data in live right when you're in the field. And it makes it just easier. And so you don't have to forget, or you don't have to take additional time to collect data. So if anybody has any remaining questions, I'll give you a minute or so to think about it and go ahead and ask. Otherwise, we're going to start to wrap up here. I wanted to thank everybody for coming today and listening in. And if you have additional questions that we did not answer or you think about it later, feel free to reach back out to Carrie and myself. You should have information, I believe, to be able to contact both of us. And check out, even if you don't participate, check out the website, www.frogwatchstl.com. And there's lots of good resources on there. And if you hear something and you want to share it with us, feel free to go on our Facebook page or even email it to us and let us know what you were hearing around the area. We're trying to get a good idea of what's happening to our frogs and toads. And we'll try to communicate that back out to everybody else. And I want to say thank you, Carrie, for helping out today and being the tech person and watching our chat.